Excellencies, honorable speakers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Siddharth and I feel privileged to welcome you all on behalf of TERI to the plenary session titled Role of Biodiversity Conservation in a Green and Resilient Post-Pandemic Economy at this World Sustainable Development Summit 2021. Ladies and gentlemen, today is an auspicious day for all of us here at TERI. Hence, before we proceed, we would like to release 6 policy briefs focusing on enhancing carbon sink through forestry in India. The first policy brief, titled Estimation of Current Emission and Sequestration as well as Future Potential of Sequestration Emission Reduction to Achieve Land Degradation Neutrality in India, focuses on analyzing the emission, status of sequestration, emission reduction, as well as the future potential of sequestration of different land use sectors such as forestry, animal husbandry, wetlands, mining, and agriculture within India. The second policy brief, titled Baseline and Quantification of Sequestration of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030, focuses on setting targets to achieve the forest carbon sink by 2030, as well as analyzing gaps and addressing challenges in achieving them. The third policy brief on designing the methodology to establish minimum support prices of trees grown outside forests focuses on charting a roadmap for providing MSP, which will provide a social safety net to the farmers that will in turn motivate them to take up agroforestry plantations and generate additional carbon finance. The fourth policy brief, titled Scope and Potential of Coastal Ecosystems in Mitigating Climate Change, focuses on recognition of coastal ecosystems such as mangroves, seagrasses, tidal marshes, and coral reefs in climate change mitigation and explore the possibilities of contribution of blue carbon in achieving India's NDC targets. The last 2 policy briefs that you can see on your screen, titled Will India Attain its Forestry NDC target of achieving 2.53 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent through additional forest and tree cover by 2030. And the second policy brief, titled Innovative Financial Mechanism to Achieve this Target. They both focus on holistic approach with balanced political, financial, legal, and institutional efforts to achieve this target, and particularly elaborate the financial mechanisms required to bridge a financial gap of Indian rupees 48,744 crores needed to achieve this target in context of sustainable forest management. So all these policy briefs, ladies and gentlemen, are available on TERI website as well as on the official WSDS website. The links are here on your screen. Those interested can access them anytime, anywhere. So coming back to the topic for today's plenary session, ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, that loss of biodiversity has enormous implications for a society, for poverty alleviation, and for meeting the sustainable development goals. The strong linkages between biodiversity and pandemics have very well been understood during the current COVID-19 situation. The current pandemic that has brought the entire world to its knees is a direct reminder that it is actually humanity's destruction of biodiversity that creates the condition for these new viruses and diseases and can have significant human health impacts along with economic impacts worldwide. The plenary session on role of biodiversity conservation in a green and resilient post-pandemic economy highlights the importance of biodiversity for the economy and the need of its institutionalization in response to the current pandemic situation. It is envisaged that today's deliberations will garner strong support for One Health approach and would be a precursor to the CBD COP15 being held in Kunming, China this year, focusing on the theme ecological civilization, building a shared future for all. Now, without further ado, I request Ms. Marie Haga to deliver the keynote address. Ms. Haga has worn many hats a Norwegian diplomat, politician, and international civil servant, and she's presently working as Vice President, External Relations and Governance Department, the International Fund for Agriculture Development, IFAD, of the United Nations Rural Development Agency. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And it's truly an honor for me to have this opportunity to address the plenary session today on the very important topic, the role of biodiversity conservation in a green and resilient post-pandemic economy. Thank you so much for inviting me, but more importantly, thank you so much for putting the importance of biodiversity on the agenda. Biodiversity is one of the most important, and I dare to say least recognized, natural resources. I know that many of you will participate, not the least in the panel today, have been fighting for getting biodiversity higher on the agenda for years, and I just want to thank you for that. Let's hope that COVID, in all its madness, increases the understanding of the fabulous opportunities that biodiversity offers, and also how much more vulnerable it makes us as a global community if we are not sensible enough to safeguard what is left of biodiversity. Because we are losing biodiversity as we speak. We're losing it because of climate change, because of urbanization, because of the way we do agriculture, just to mention a few. And this is really my main point today. Losing biodiversity fundamentally means that we lose options for the future. We are limiting our options each time we lose biodiversity. This can be changed. We know a lot about how to safeguard biodiversity. It's a question of understanding, a question of political will, and a question of a bit of money. However, in terms of money, we speak about what I call this being a truly inexpensive insurance policy for the world to safeguard biodiversity. And I can take an example. To safeguard agro-biodiversity ex situ, we know the cost is $34 million a year. If we as a global community decided to establish a fund to have those $34 million a year available, it would require a fund of $850 million. I recognize that is a lot of money, but it's actually less than what it costs to build a regular soccer stadium around the world. So for the price of a soccer stadium, we can safeguard agro-biodiversity forever. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, in my 10 minutes intervention, I will concentrate on agro-biodiversity because that's what I know the most about. And in my humble opinion, it's clear that we will not be able to develop a resilient post-pandemic food system nor a post-pandemic resilient economy unless we safeguard and, of course, make use of agro-biodiversity. You know, in many ways, we can say that our food system has been a great success. The Green Revolution, spearheaded by Bolav, and not the least our dear Professor Swaminathan, it's been possible to grow enough food had it been equally distributed for an exponentially growing population since the 1960s. You know, it is quite amazing what we've been able to achieve. At the same time, there are, of course, people who are speaking about a food system as our food system as a failure. And that is because we, after all, have 800 million people suffering from hunger. 1 out of 3 suffer from malnutrition. 2 billion people don't get enough vitamins and minerals every day. And at the same time, roughly 2 billion people overeat. 600 million people are obese. We waste 30 to 40% of our food. And something like 30, 33, 34, 35% of our soil is degraded. So, you can in a way choose if you want to say it's a success or a failure. I think it's fair to say that we have a food system that is off track. Clearly, the challenge ahead is to produce more food, more nutritious food, food that is produced with less water, less pesticides, less fertilizer, generally less environmental footprint. And the food has to be affordable for people. I am not saying that agro-biodiversity solves all these problems, but it clearly has the potential to contribute to solving many of them. And after all, making sure we have a functioning food system, it's the basis for our economic systems. So how can I say that biodiversity can solve so many of these problems we are facing? Well, we have this amazing diversity of crops. We have 1,000 varieties of banana, 3,000 varieties of coconut, 4,500 varieties of potatoes, probably roughly 35,000 varieties of corn or maize, 125 varieties of wheat, and most likely roughly 200,000 varieties of rice around the world. And the beauty of this diversity is that all of these varieties have different traits, so we can use them for different things. We have several million crop varieties around the world that we can use in different circumstances, but also, and very importantly, this is the raw material that we need to improve crops and breed new varieties. And this breeding can be done through natural breeding. I personally don't take a stand on the use of genetically modified organisms, but I do say that if we don't want to go down the GM route, we can make use of the existing diversity, and you would find the traits you need if we are just able to mine what is in this diversity. And we know, ladies and gentlemen, that we can put biodiversity to use to produce more food. The Green Revolution showed us that. We can produce healthier food. We know we have developed sweet potatoes with higher content of vitamin A, beans with higher iron content. We know we can use biodiversity to fight diseases, to provide better taste, to adapt to new climatic conditions and a more unpredictable weather. We know all this. We have seen the examples. It can be done. These seeds, this biodiversity, it's really miracles. But we have lost a tremendous amount. We are losing gradually more. Like if we go to China, they have lost, or they don't have in the field anymore, roughly 90% of the rice varieties that they had in 1950. 80% of corn in Mexico is lost. The US have lost 90% of their fruit and vegetable varieties since the early 1900s. So we got to be wise. We got to safeguard what we have left. And again, for each variety, in this case, when we speak about agro-biodiversity, we lose options to produce the food and create the basis for the economy that the world needs for the future. This biodiversity is spread around the world. When it comes to agro-biodiversity, we absolutely need to make sure that we share that to take out the potential. And that is why the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture is so fundamentally important. It maybe doesn't work as well as we would have liked it to do, but it is our best bet, because none of us have all the biodiversity that we need in the future. But of course, there has to be an element of benefit sharing there, and that is really the nut that we haven't been able to crack up to now. So, no question, transformation of the global food system as a basis for the future economy requires better and smarter use of biodiversity. This goes for all of agriculture, but small-scale farmers have, in my view, the greatest potential to be the agents of change that we need. And I'm going to finish with that. You know, 50% of food globally is produced by small-scale farmers. They have the potential to do a lot more for us all to develop a resilient food system in a green economy. We got to give them the tools, the knowledge, and a bit of capital, and they can be these agents of change that we desperately need. And we can at the same time help them get out of the poverty trap that so many small producers are facing. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by repeating: biodiversity is a fundamental part of the solution to develop a green and resilient post-pandemic economy. Without it, our options are dramatically reduced. And biodiversity can be safeguarded. It is not rocket science. It doesn't cost a tremendous amount of money. It's a very inexpensive insurance policy for the world. We know how to do this. It can be done. So let's do it for the benefit of our generation, for our children, but also for the benefit of all future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marie, for giving your valuable insights on today's topic of discussion. I think it has set a perfect platform for our speakers to take this discussion forward. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now start the panel discussion. We have a very diverse and experienced panel today, but to introduce them, I would like to first invite the session moderator, Dr. V B Mathur. Dr. Mathur is a 1983 batch retired IFS officer from West Bengal cadre, who's presently working as chairperson of the National Biodiversity Authority of India. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you, Siddharth. And thank you, Mary, once again for making a very strong case for biodiversity and for setting the stage for our discussion today. I must say that we have a very accomplished panel of 6 speakers today. And they come from US, from Canada, from Germany, from Philippines, and of course, India. But I must also share with you that on account of time differences, it's about 5 a.m. in the United States. 2 of our panelists from US and Canada had to send their pre-recorded video, which we would be listening in a while from now. But I would like to now begin by inviting our first panelist, none other than Ms. Emmy Frankel. She is presently the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Migratory Species, or CMS as we call it, and she is joining us or has joined us live from Bonn. So welcome, Emmy. Emmy brings with her over 3 decades of professional experience in international environmental law and policy, and has held senior positions in the UN system, including the legislative and executive branches of the US government, and also in private law practices. She holds the Juris Doctorate from Harvard Law School. So Amy, we plunge into action and taking advantage of your vast experience and your intense involvement with the conservation and migratory species. I have 2 questions for you. Beginning with what are the actions needed for the conservation of migratory wildlife? And how does combating wildlife crime protect biodiversity and at the same time prevent zoonotic diseases? So our audience would like to know answers of these questions based on the work that you do and the experience that you have. So over to you, Emmy.
Okay, thank you so much, Vinod. It is really a pleasure to join you here and to participate in this World Sustainable Development Summit, which I understand is its 20th anniversary. So I want to say many thanks and congratulations to Dr. V B Mathur and your team. And thank you so much for having me. It is wonderful to be back in India, at least virtually. At least I can see and be with my dear friends really exactly 1 year after the very successful 13th Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Migratory Species that was hosted by India in Gandhinagar, and to take part in this panel with so many key partners who collaborate with CMS on these issues. Now, I literally decided minutes before I am now speaking to reverse the order of my answer to your question, Vino, because what I realized is we have to really start by talking about the linkages of migratory species with the broader global conditions, including the pandemic, and then I will come back to some specific areas for action under CMS. So by way of introduction, as we know, migratory species travel. They travel often long distances and across multiple national borders. So the first answer to your question is that the only way to ensure the conservation of species is for countries to work together. CMS exists. The only reason it exists is because we need cooperation across either 2 or 3 or more countries. That's why we are here. So CMS is a global treaty of the United Nations, and we provide this unique platform for international cooperation to conserve migratory species and their habitats. Now, we cover a very large range of species, including avian species such as the great Indian bustard, terrestrial species such as the Asian elephant, and aquatic species, including sharks, turtles, whales, river dolphins. We have hundreds of different species that we deal with, actually thousands if you count all our birds. Now, at COP13, we released an important study. It's an interim study, and in fact, we're working on a flagship report for our next COP to better understand what's happening. But the initial study found on the status of migratory species that the majority of CMS species are declining. And the 2 main threats to their status were habitat loss and fragmentation and direct use. This is also consistent with the findings of the IPBES report, the UN entity that looks at biodiversity and ecosystem services. They released this global assessment in 2019. So what does all that have to do with infectious diseases such as COVID? As speakers have already noted, the linkages couldn't be clearer. Now, CMS itself has been dealing with wildlife diseases for many years, starting with avian influenza back in early 2000s. The risks that have been documented are that the same risks that increase the likelihood of infectious diseases such as COVID-19 are the same risks that are causing the decline of species. So, in other words, if we work to protect species, we're also going to be working to protect our own health. And those 2 risks, again, are first, the destruction of and fragmentation of natural habitat and the encroachment of activities that bring humans and their livestock in close proximity to wild species, which increases the risk of spillovers of pathogens to humans. And there's also the direct use of wild species, which I'll talk about a bit further. So when you think of migratory species, in these discussions on protecting biodiversity, there's been a trend to really focus on what's called mainstreaming biodiversity, looking, as we should, we need to look at the core drivers of biodiversity loss. But it's also important to remember that species and migratory species are an integral part of ecosystems and nature. And we can't separate them and say, oh, those are just species. We have to focus on the important biodiversity that provides benefits to us. Well, migratory species are integrated into that. And so by protecting migratory species, we look at migratory species as really an indicator of the state of our natural world and of our own health. And so the risk of future diseases provides only another reason to protect wild species and their habitat. Now, while this connection might be clear to the speakers and the participants at this summit, we have a long ways to go to actually change our conventional approaches to economic and social well-being. Now, the IPBES report identified what they call drivers of change. And they talked about direct drivers such as agriculture, overfishing, those things that we know, the direct activities. And they also talked about the indirect drivers, such as our very economic system, how it drives that change, equity issues, and our values. And so it's a big answer to your question, but in order to protect migratory species, we do have to address all of this. We have to address the direct drivers and the indirect drivers, because otherwise we're really putting band-aids on the problem and not looking at the fundamental causes of change. So with that, here we are, CMS. We are a very focused convention. We are at the receiving end of a lot of the threats because we don't have the mandate to deal with the things that cause our change. However, we need to be at the table working with the other entities, and we do collaborate across the UN, across the globe, with countries, across countries, and at the community level to see the kind of change we need to make. So let me now turn a little bit more focused on CMS and what we bring to the table. So first, the actions for migratory species, I like to sort of think of them in two categories. One is to address their conservation needs, and the other is to address activities that pose threats. I won't go into all the things that CMS COP13 agreed on because there were many actions, and I would invite participants to go to our website to learn more about what we do, ranging from national legislation, concerted actions for specific species, and area-based initiatives such as transfrontier conservation areas. Let me just highlight a few key outcomes. First, very importantly, COP13 endorsed the need to address ecological connectivity as a matter of priority. Now, migratory species rely on a network of geographical areas, sometimes thousands of miles apart, as part of their natural life cycles for breeding and feeding. So we need action to conserve and restore areas that support them. This includes, and also address the threats. And those threats include simple things like roads, fences, as well as major energy infrastructure. We can do this in a manner that protects nature while meeting development needs. And I have to, of course, note that the Wildlife Institute of India, which Vino used to lead, has pioneered work in this area, finding solutions that allow wildlife to coexist with roads and other infrastructure. CMS has significant ongoing work in this area, including with respect to energy. Now, the importance of connectivity is gaining traction as a priority for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework because it's a powerful tool for achieving the objectives of not only CMS, but the Convention of Biodiversity, as well as the Climate Change Treaty, and also the Desertification Treaty. So all of the Rio conventions. Second, another outcome, very important, is that we need to understand what's driving the change to species. And one of those less well documented is the direct take of migratory species. Now, this goes far beyond species that are traded internationally. So it's important that we shine a spotlight on what's happening on the ground. It includes species taken for use within a country, for food, for income, for sport, for religious practices, and other reasons. So the results of this work will be key to understanding some of the pressures on migratory species and the need to address illegal killing, but also broader issues such as food security and human development needs in a way that we can reduce unsustainable impacts on species. Two last points. COP13 also called for renewed action to address the conservation challenges of the Central Asian flyway. Now, this covers 30 countries, including India, and India stepped up to really make a commitment to lead and contribute to this. It's a perfect example of the need to approach conservation with a connectivity lens. And we will be working closely with India and the range states to take this resolution forward. My last point is that COP13 also recognized the importance of community engagement for both species and habitat conservation. This is another area where India has considerable experience, which could serve as a model for other countries. And so by my response, I hope you see that I've gone from the global and the huge implications of COVID, migratory species, and how it's connected to our own well-being, all the way down to the community level. And I don't mean to be, sort of trite about it, because we really do need action at these different levels. We need to work together to show good examples, successes, and how it's possible for human development and well-being to live hand in hand with the conservation of nature. It's possible. There's great examples in India, but we also need to work across our own silo with partners to address the broader issues of biodiversity, what's driving it both directly and indirectly. So I want to thank you again. My last point is that we need to work not only to address the needs of migratory species, but really to address our own needs in that way. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure again to join you.
Thanks, Emmy, for a very insightful response. And we are very pleased to know about the plans which you, as leading the CMS, wants to do. And definitely under the CMS presidency, we would like to take this thing forward. Definitely combating wildlife crime and preventing zoonotic diseases is a priority for everyone. And as you have very rightly said, that measures to reduce the overexploitation of species will certainly help to reduce the risk of future pandemics. So with now leaving Emmy in Germany, we now move to Midori in New York. She has been the UNDP head of ecosystem and biodiversity program based in New York since 2016, holds a master's degree in environment and development from University of Cambridge. She has a very large portfolio of 300 projects in 130 countries. And on account of the time differences, she cannot join us live, but we engaged her on a video and we asked Midori the following question. How does the worldwide sustainable trade in biodiversity-friendly source products and services under the fair and equitable benefit sharing schemes, how do these assist in reducing the risk of emergence and spread of zoonosis? So you are all aware that because of the current pandemic and its relation with zoonosis, it is a hot issue. So let me now request that we need to play the video recording which we had for Midori, in which she answers these questions and adds something more to it. So over to you.
Hello, it's my great honor to speak today, and thank you so much for your very kind invitation. Today, I would like to talk about the war that humanity is waging, to use the UN Secretary General's word, against nature, and also talk about his suggestions for making peace. This will need work on many battlefronts because the planet is definitely suffering from the scorched earth policies. We are losing areas of forest that are larger than Portugal every year. 2 out of 5 hectares of land are already degraded. Over 2 billion people are living in areas with high water stress. And the casualties of this war on nature are likely to be 1 million species or more in coming decades. And of course, the ultimate casualty is us, humans, who depend on biodiversity for survival and well-being. And the year 2020 saw the starkest manifestation of the global risks of biodiversity loss. COVID-19 has shown so vividly that our war on nature, our GDP-centric view of growth, and human greed and reckless selfishness can bring serious social and economic and health emergencies on a global scale. In the last century, people thought development was about becoming independent of nature. Development was about not having to depend on rain to produce crops, which is understandable. And development was about an industry-scale plantation business that removed inefficient nature for more productive use. But actually, nature is fundamental to human development in the 21st century, in COVID recovery, and in a quest to reduce probability and impact of future pandemics. And in order to end the war on nature, we have to recalibrate our economies to be able to develop with nature, and for the economy to be able to invest in nature. Therefore, UNDP's COVID recovery offer has green economy as an important pillar. So what needs to be done? To start with, we need to stop paying for destruction of nature and greenhouse gas emissions. I'm talking about both public and private financing here. We need to redirect global finance flows from nature negative to nature positive. We need to tap the opportunities of increased interest in sovereign debt restructuring in the face of the current COVID-linked debt crisis, and connect debt restructuring and relief with nature conservation and restoration results that also can create millions of jobs. We need to overhaul the production and consumption system, and we need to leverage the power of people, legal and human rights constituencies, to make destruction of nature a serious crime and create pressure and liability for those who destroy what is treated by some as their own, but which in the profoundest sense of the word is ours, our common heritage, our life support system, and our safety net. We need to ensure that governments fully integrate nature at the very heart of development planning and budget. And one example of the UNDP's effort in this regard is our latest Human Development Report. Human Development Index traditionally looks at three key dimensions of development: a long and healthy life, being knowledgeable, and have a decent standard of living. In addition, in our 2020 report, we brought in countries' carbon dioxide emissions and material footprint and added them to the mix, which led to remarkable shifting of individual countries' index scores. And it really laid bare that humanity's progress will stall if we continue to exploit and destroy our natural environment. We know that half of the 169 SDG targets need nature to achieve them. We know half of the global GDP is dependent on nature. And the nature-positive business transition could generate up to $10.1 trillion in annual business value and create 395 million jobs by 2030. And also, we must regain and nurture our love and affinity for nature to make peace with nature. And in this regard, I believe India can lead the world based on your inherently strong cultural and personal connection with nature. there is an urgent need to wage peace and to recover our future. Perhaps the saddest and the most foolish aspect of this war is that we are not fighting an enemy. We are actually fighting our greatest ally.
Okay, so I think on behalf of all of us, we need to thank Midori for very aptly responding to our questions and for making a very strong case. I really like the way she said we need to end the war on nature and to reiterate that nature is fundamental for human development. The sooner we understand it, the better it is. So from Midori, we now move to a third panelist, Dr. Mundita Lim, who is joining us live from Philippines. She is the Executive Director of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity. She has been the chair of the CBD Substa in 2017 and 2018. Her core competencies and extensive experience and expertise are in local, regional, and international governance, management policy development, and advocacy, all in the field of biodiversity conservation and wildlife protection. So thank you, Theresa, for joining us. I would begin by asking you two questions to you as well, because you are the leader as far as the ASEAN countries are concerned. So what has been the response of ASEAN countries to the current pandemic situation? And what kind of future strategies are you planning to adopt for reducing the risk of emergence and spread of zoonosis in future? Because it is quite certain that there is no guarantee that we may not have COVID and zoonosis and other diseases. So I would now request you to kindly respond and let us have the benefit of seeing the response of ASEAN. We are definitely, Theresa, running short of time. So I would like you and request you to be brief. So over to you, Theresa.
Thank you very much, Vinod, and nice to see you again online. We've been meeting each other so often lately in webinars. And of course, I'm very honored to be part of your panel. Good evening from the Philippines, and good afternoon, good morning to the rest of the world who are here. So thank you for your questions. First, thank you. I would like to briefly share our experience in Southeast Asia. You mentioned ASEAN. I'm sure you are familiar with ASEAN, but for the rest of the world, ASEAN are 10 countries that have organized together, 10 countries in Southeast Asia to organize with each other, and the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity was created by the 10 countries to address the issues and concerns that is being faced by the region on biodiversity and to help address biodiversity loss. So we have seen that in the process of recovering from COVID-19 pandemic, it became an opportunity for us to reset and change our relationship with nature. After a year into this pandemic that has affected lives and disrupted normalcy, the nexus between biodiversity, health, and socioeconomic development has never been clearer. In November 2020, the ASEAN leaders adopted the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework and its implementation plan, which highlights nature-based solutions to increase the region's resilience against future pandemics. It is an important document that has been guiding us on our way forward. And a key component of this recovery plan is the development of mechanisms to increase investments in natural solutions, in wildlife enforcement, and in habitat protection, preventing future pandemics at source. It would be challenging to bring things back to normal. So we are building back better
and with the threat of emerging infectious diseases as a result of loss of nature and human-driven activities, we really need to take a step back to see things from a broader perspective. And our previous speakers have articulated that very clearly. The ASEAN's recovery plan recognizes as well biodiversity as a cross-cutting issue. An essential part of its implementation is strengthening biodiversity mainstreaming, which requires scaling up cross-sectoral collaboration that's thinking beyond the silos and understanding interconnectivity. So Amy was also on point, and this is something that we are one of the means that one of the ways that we are moving forward in the ASEAN, and we are guided by the recovery framework. With the plan, with this recovery framework plan, the biodiversity sector is working with the other ASEAN bodies, such as the working groups that are the bodies that are the senior officials and the other centers that are working on health and on agriculture. We also conduct various communication and education activities along with our partners to encourage individuals and communities to adopt behaviors and lifestyles that address the root causes of pandemics and zoonosis. These initiatives are aligned with our efforts to bring to the fore the critical role of biodiversity and nature-based solutions, particularly in sectors such as agriculture, infrastructure, and tourism. In the tourism sector, for example, which is among the biggest economic contributors in the region, accounting for more than 12% of the regional GDP, conserving biodiversity makes business sense. And as we are in the process of opening up our tourism activities, it is important that we seriously take into account the treatment of our resources and our biodiversity. Increasing investments in nature-based solutions and ecosystem restoration is thus necessary in building a resilient post-pandemic economy. But for these approaches to be effective, robust cooperation within the region is also important, and across regions is critical. The ASEAN, for example, has a very robust partnership with India under our ASEAN-India Development Partnership. Countries in the same region and sub-region are often similarly situated, and frequently we share common development narratives, challenges, and opportunities. With the interconnectivity of our ecosystems, we have more reasons to work closely together through meaningful partnerships, science policy dialogues, and conscientious exchanges of information, knowledge, and practices within the region and across the region. Under existing cooperation, such as our cooperation with India, South-South cooperation, and other partners, we have the opportunity to craft context-specific actions to address biodiversity concerns by advancing natural solutions and creating enabling environments that will redound to health and socioeconomic benefits. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Mr. Moderator, for allowing us to share our experience in the ASEAN for this World Sustainable Development Summit 2021.
Thank you, Theresa, for very clearly responding to the questions and emphasizing that recovery from COVID-19 pandemic is an opportunity also to reset and change our relationship with nature. I hope all of us and those who are listening can understand that why it is so important now to reset our relationship and to ensure that the mainstreaming of biodiversity becomes an essential part of the recovery process. So with this now, we move Philippines to Canada, virtually of course, to be with Mr. Basile. He is the Director General of the Biodiversity Policy and Partnership Directorate in the Canadian Wildlife Service. He is also the co-chair of the open-ended working group, which is currently very active negotiating the global biodiversity framework. And he is the most sought after person, and we are glad that we could get him to spare some time to talk to us. We asked him 2 questions. that what are likely to be the targets and indicators in the post-2020 GBF to deal with issues like the current pandemic. Because when we started talking of GBF, the pandemic was not there. So we now need to take cognizance of that. And obviously, the world is now talking about the One Health approach. We will also hear from our Indian panelist, Madam Uma, what India is trying to do. But definitely, we would like to know what is happening on the One Health approach. And with this, I would request that we can play Basile's video.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, participant of the World Sustainable Development Summit. My name is Basile van Havre, and I'm the co-chair of the open-ended working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework under the Convention on Biological Diversity. I've been asked to talk to you about the link between pandemic, biodiversity conservation, and green economy. I'd like to start by highlighting the interconnection between biodiversity, climate change, and human health. A 2019 IPBES report highlighted that around 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction, many within this decade, more than ever before in human history. The health and diversity of living organisms and ecosystem is crucial for our economies, livelihood, food security, health, and quality of life. It is now clearly understood that healthy species and ecosystem, as well as well-managed interaction between humans and animals, are essential to the prevention of future pandemics. The interconnectedness of thriving biodiversity and human prosperity is highlighted by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which is believed to have, as for most pandemics, zoonotic origins. The lesson we all need to learn going forward is that all efforts must be made to foster a sustainable relationship with nature. This conclusion is also supported by a more recent report by the IPBES, which demonstrates that the underlying cause of pandemics are the same global environmental change that drive biodiversity loss and climate change, including land use change, agricultural expansion and intensification, and wildlife trade and consumption. As such, our work on negotiating a robust and ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework that will lead to transformative change across various sectors of the economy is even more important. As part of our effort to recognize and integrate the work on addressing cross-linkage between biodiversity loss and human health, in December 2020, the Secretariat of the CBD held a two-day webinar on One Health approach that will inform our negotiation of goals and targets for nature. Further, in our work on developing a new monitoring framework for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, we are confident that the One Health approach will be reflected, and I invite you to consult the framework and provide your comments to the subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice. Finally, I want to remark that while human health may not be explicitly captured in our targets, if we're able to successfully negotiate and implement, we can expect tremendous benefits for biodiversity, human health, pandemic prevention, and prosperity. This will require significant transformation of our food production, supply chain, regulated and sustainable management, and harvest of wildlife species. And last but not least, improve land use planning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I hope you will have a fruitful discussion today and on this important issue, and I'm looking forward to reading the outcome of your deliberation.
Thank you, Basile. On behalf of all of us, we would like to thank him for responding to a very important question on the global efforts that are going on. And definitely the post-2020 GBF would focus on the interconnectedness between ecosystems and economy and the urgent need to promote green economy. So thank you, Basile. With this, we now move back from Canada to India, and we have with us my colleague, Dr. J V Sharma. He is the Director, Forest and Biodiversity at the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI as we call it, based in New Delhi. He holds a doctorate degree in economic valuation of forest ecosystems and has over 3 decades of experience in leading, in coordinating, in managing projects and activities in the forestry sector. He also has extensive expertise in global forest policy and international negotiations. He has also been the chief negotiator on behalf of the Government of India under the UNFF process. So Dr. Sharma, I have 2 questions also for you. The first one is that what is the contribution of biodiversity and ecosystem services in the overall economy? You could take the global example, or you could come up to a country-based example, but we need to know that what is the contribution that everybody is talking about, and what are the best instruments to capture this contribution? Because valuation of ecosystem services is not easy. Many times they go undervalued. So we would like to know what are your views based on your experience. So over to you.
Thank you, Vinod. I will be explaining how the biodiversity and the ecosystem services are contributing towards the economy and the human well-being. What are the challenges before us and how to overcome those challenges. So if I start with that, food production relies on biodiversity for a variety of the food plants, pollination, pest control, nutrient provisions, genetic diversity, and disease prevention and control. Even medicinal plant and the manufactured pharmaceuticals also rely on the biodiversity. Many ecosystem services provided by biodiversity are such as nutrient cycle, carbon sequestration, pest regulation, and pollination sustain agriculture productivity. When the ecosystem structure is converted into the economic products and resulting waste returned to the ecosystem, often in novel form to which ecosystem have not had an opportunity to adapt it. Ecosystem services are affected. Economic production unavoidably affect the provisions of the ecosystem services. Ecosystem and the biological diversity provide a stream of goods and services, continued delivery of which remain essential in our economic prosperity and other aspects of the welfare. The benefit of these services manifest themselves at local, regional, and even global scale, with often conflicting demand between stakeholders at these different levels. One of the most pervasive impact of the current global change in the rapid decline in the species and habitat diversity and its replacement with biological poorer and more human-dominated landscapes. The loss of species is the most widely recognized. The consequences of such change and biodiversity underpins the human life support system. Its loss implies significant consequences for the humanity. The consequences of ecosystem degradation are experienced more severely in developing countries, the home of vast majority of the world's natural capital, and to the world's poor, who are heavily reliant on natural resource for the livelihood and ecosystem. Here I like to give the particular example of in India, and more than 350 million people are deriving their full or partial livelihood living in and around the forest and forest biodiversity. Here I am not touching the agriculture. Agriculture is separate, and they are deriving, and major threat is the sustainability. The unsustainable harvest is a key issue for the loss of the species and impacting the ecosystem services, not even ecosystem services, even the livelihood and income of the people of the present generation and the future generation. And driving force behind the ecosystem degradation are many and interlinked. Human society has for centuries taken for granted the services provided by natural system, partly because they are not formally traded and marketed and are therefore disassociated from the pricing that reflects and warns of the changes in the supply or the demand conditions. Just as a market fail to signal ecosystem degradation, economic policies frequently provide preverse many developing countries, property rights are lacking. Of course, in India, we have a very strong policy, regulatory, and institutional mechanism aspect. lack of clear environmental policies, goals, poor enforcement of existing regulations, corruption, lack of political will, and lack of institutional capacity are examples of failing governance that also lead to the ecosystem. Governance is a very, very key, and particularly in where the people are depending for their livelihood and income. In addition, our limited capacity to deal with the potentially consequences of the ecosystem degradation is exacerbated by the lack of adequate information and knowledge about the ecosystem function and the benefit they generate for the society. We know we have the knowledge. Better information on its own will not bring about the sustainable use of the ecosystem, achievable only if this information is then used to address the drivers of the ecosystem degradation. Example of the measures capable of capturing demonstrated value include payment for provision of the ecosystem services, creation of the market for ecosystem services where they do not already exist, improving the property rights system, enhancing the assets of the poor, improving the quality of economic growth, reforming international and industrial country policy, and improving the governance. There are some examples of the payment for ecosystem services. Glaring example from the Costa Rica. And if I take example from the United States, payment for Boston and New York City water supply, and also in India, there are some mechanism of the payment for ecosystem services, net present value by diversion of the forest land for the non-forestry purposes. For wildlife conservation also, when the wildlife areas have been diverted, so there is a separate kind of a financial mechanism to restore that kind of the ecology. And also green cess, coal cess, many fragmented steps have been taken in India also, and in most of the developing countries do not have mechanism of the payment mechanism of the ecosystem services. Again, I will emphasize as India as an example that we have Article 21, which is applicable not only for the citizen of the country, but whosoever, even a foreigners living in the country, that fundamental right is applicable to them also. And clean environment and the health is a part of the fundamental right under the Article 21 of the Constitution. And many provisions in the Constitution of India, regulatory mechanisms are there, but still I will say that in India, we also need to act more efficiently while implementing the regulatory and the policy regime. We also have community-based forest governance system. We have to build the capacity of the community. How the present regulatory and policy regime can be utilized for enhancing their income as well as the sustainable use of the resource. With these words, I have the 3 points that the economic valuation of the ecosystem services and biodiversity conservation must be a part of the planning process of the developmental activities. Financial allocation and policy interventions are needed to maintain ecosystem services and biodiversity conservation. And in the last, importance of the ecosystem services and biodiversity conservation must be a part of the education of the youth, so that in future we can transfer the knowledge and capacity of conserving biodiversity and ecosystem services for the future generation. Thank you very much, Vinod.
Thank you, JV, for responding not only to those questions in a very candid manner, but also making a very strong case that economic valuation of ecosystem services must become an integral part of our planning process. So with this, we move to our final panelist, Madam Umadevi. She is the Additional Secretary in the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, and she is responsible for all biodiversity-related matters, has extensive experience of working both in the federal government and in the state government in various capacities. She was also the faculty member at the prestigious Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration in Missouri. where she was involved in sensitizing the young civil servants from various backgrounds to aspects of environment and forestry. So, ma'am, I have two very quick questions for you. You have been leading from the top the National Mission on Biodiversity and Human Well-being, how that mission is going to help in biodiversity mainstreaming. And as a part of the mission, we do have a component on One Health. It would be nice to hear your views at how India is trying to take up the challenge of planning and implementing the One Health approach. So over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be part of this panel today, panel discussion. As my previous speakers have already mentioned, funding for biodiversity conservation will not only help in recovering the post-pandemic economy, but will also help in preventing future pandemics. And as my previous speakers have already mentioned, that it has become an established fact that majority of the new emerging and infection human diseases are zoonotic in nature, and most of which find their origin from the wild animals, and the destruction of biodiversity brings these wild animals closer to human beings. So we need to devise a strategy which recognizes the interconnections between the health of the animals, the human beings, and environment in disease control and prevention. So therefore, through this One Health approach, which Mr. Mathur mentioned, which is a multi-sectoral coordination of various departments, wildlife department, the animal husbandry department, the veterinary department, and the environment and public health departments, and Department of Biotechnology, for proactive monitoring and surveillance and controlling the diseases systematically, starting from the source, that is from the pathogens and animals, and simultaneously controlling the possible pathways of transmission to human beings through conserving biodiversity and controlling the wildlife trade. We can avoid the outbreaks of future pandemics. So even though a lot of progress has been done globally in terms of One Health initiative, this is still at a very embryonic stage in India. And we need to have cooperation at the international as well as at the regional health in the area of this One Health approach. So Government of India has taken some initiative using this One Health approach, but there are several challenges, especially at the level of implementation. I'm really very happy to share this, that One Health approach is one of the important components of the National Mission on Biodiversity and Human Well-being, which is one of the 8 missions launched by our Prime Minister's Scientific and Technology Council. And the Ministry of Environment and Forest is the nodal ministry for implementation of this mission, and we are in the process of finalizing this mission. So this mission has basically 2 components. First component dealing with the documentation and monitoring and biodiversity management, and the second component which has 6 programs, of which one is related to biodiversity and health, which deals with the One Health initiative. So the key outcome of this One Health initiative under the Biodiversity National Human Mission is as follows. One is to map all the hotspots of emerging infectious disease in India, and the creation of One Health platform, creation of a network of institutions doing research on these zoonotic diseases, then the capacity building of scientists and the technical staff who are involved in this One Health initiative, and surveillance and research, and setting up of surveillance networks across India to predict and prevention of the disease, and preparation of plans and guidelines for each sectoral partner at the state and the national level. So this component will be, there's one component which will focus mainly on the capacity building of the government staff, the local NGOs, the local communities, to understand the basics of One Health approach in partnership with the Ministry of other ministries like the Ministry of Fisheries and Animal Husbandry. So while government has taken these initiatives, there are several challenges, as I said earlier. And one of the main challenges is the interministerial coordination and lack of legal framework to implement this One Health initiative, which is a big challenge. So we need to integrate other programs of the government so that there is sharing of experiences and knowledge as well as infrastructure already created under other programs. So we need to have better coordination and collaboration, and with this better coordination collaboration, there should be a good beginning for One Health initiative in India. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uma ma'am, for providing an update on the big national mission on biodiversity and human well-being. As the conservation community knows that never before in our 73 years, we have had this kind of a mission. And the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, along with the National Biodiversity Authority, is the forefront of it. And we do have a very important component, as you said, on One Health, and we need to develop a shared vision so that we are able to implement it in a very nice manner. So these are some of the actions which will unfurl in a few months from now as we seek approvals. So with this, we come to an end to our presenters, and surely our audience would like to know that what is the kind of takeaways that we have from these sessions. We have heard our speakers, we heard our keynote panelist, Marie, talking about it, and then our team has very quickly looked up at the takeaways. Can you see the slide now? Siddharth, can you see the slide?
No, not yet, sir.
Okay, 1 second. Let me try again. Let me try. Okay. Can you see it now?
No.
No.
What is happening?
I can just upload it from my side if you.
Oh, can you upload it fast? So I will quickly run through that. So see what we heard, our 6 different panelists were different aspects that they were covering. And one thing is very fundamental. I would like to remind what Dr. Midori said, that biodiversity and ecosystems are fundamental to human development. And I think that is where is the most strong message emerging from our panelists, that as we now talk of COVID recovery, as we now talk of our quest to reduce the probability that pandemics should not occur, but then we need to respect the biodiversity and ecosystems as they occur in different parts of the world. Very interestingly, a case was made that we need to stop the war on nature. Siddharth, can you pull up the slides? I can continue, but if you can, it will be helpful.
Yeah.
But
yes.
We need to end the war on nature, and we need to do 2 things. Our economies should be able to develop with nature. It's not either or, that either economy or ecology, we need to develop it together. And we must learn to invest in nature. See, these are very strong points that we are making. Investment in nature is required. It's not that we always draw upon nature, but we invest in nature too. There will be increased opportunity. All countries are now talking about, those of you who understand economy, we are in the process of restructuring our debt because of the COVID-linked debt crisis. We need to connect the restructuring and relief with nature conservation. And we need to ensure that the job losses which have taken place because of COVID are brought back again. We need to look at the negative incentives and subsidies which are there. And as Mr. Sharma pointed out, time again has come to look at the economic valuation of ecosystem services, and they need to become an integral part of that. And as Amy mentioned, that conservation of migratory species cannot be achieved without international cooperation. All countries, she mentioned about India, but all countries need to pitch in to see that the conservation needs are addressed and threats are minimized. And obviously, wildlife crime and overexploitation of species, which have been one of the root triggers for the current pandemic, needs to be addressed. We need to ensure that loss and fragmentation of habitat does not take place, and both the migratory species and the resident species are able to meet the risk of any risk which is coming up in future as well. And as Theresa mentioned, recovering from COVID-19 pandemic is possible. It is going to take place if we are trying to reset our relationship with nature. The nexus between biodiversity, between health, between socio-economic development was never so clear as the COVID-19 has taught us. And therefore, mainstreaming biodiversity becomes very, very important. And if you want to have this mainstreaming, we need to develop meaningful partnerships. We need to have consensuous dialogues across the region and sub-region. We already heard that what the big ASEAN region is doing, and it is a lot of things for us in Asia to learn, in South Asia to learn, that how do we create enabling environment. We need to focus on what everybody is talking. IUCN is leading the way, CBD is following, that nature-based solutions is what we need to look at. We may have solutions in concrete and cement, but we need to look at the nature-based solutions. We need to understand the importance of biodiversity, and as was being made, that communities have a role to play. So therefore, based on this, we need to develop a shared vision on One Health. We need to leverage our investments, and we need to strengthen the implementation through effective coordination. And the last point which emerged from our panelists was we need to maximize the role of the sub-regional and the regional networks. See, these networks have lots of strength, and Asia as a region needs to tell to the world that we have the ability, we have the competence to ensure that both economic development and conservation of resources can take place. So these are some of the takeaways, and I'm sure our audience would have noted on their own, but we would try to bring them together and publish them as a part of proceedings. So with these words, I hand it back to you, Siddharth, for your final concluding remarks. Thank you very much for providing this opportunity. And I would also like to thank my very esteemed panelists who, despite all the differences in time and their own busy schedule, were able to provide some very useful intervention. So back to you, Siddharth.
Yeah, I would really like to thank the session moderator and all the eminent speakers for sharing their valuable inputs. We are short on time, so we have to end this plenary session. Thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Siddharth.